It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. Now we're turning to a question that's really relevant to the work we do here every day at the Brian Lehrer Show and elsewhere at WNYC. How is artificial intelligence changing journalism? We recently did a segment on AI in fiction. Some of you heard it, where the boundaries maybe feel a little clearer because it's a purely human creation, right? A work of fiction. But journalism is a little different. It's so dependent on gathering, sorting, and synthesizing information that it's not always obvious to everybody where AI fits in or where it crosses a line. Because when we talk to journalists on this show, there's an assumption baked in that their reporting, the writing, the judgment is all fundamentally human work. So what happens if that starts to shift? Now, to be clear, there are parts of journalism that AI can't really replicate, like going out into the world, knocking on doors, building trust with sources. And let's assume for the moment that journalists ultimately write their own stories. But a lot of the rest, like first drafts of articles, summarizing documents, editing copy, even suggesting angles, can now be done, or at least assisted, by AI tools. A recent piece in the Wall Street Journal by media reporter Isabella Simonetti profiles a Fortune magazine editor, Nick Lichtenberg, who has published more than 600 stories in about 6 months. How? Mostly using AI to generate drafts. Those AI-assisted stories accounted for nearly 20% of Fortune's web traffic in the second half of last year. Now, that's a relatively extreme case, and at the same time, there has been backlash. The New York Times recently cut ties with a freelance reviewer who used AI to help write a book review that got considered plagiarism. And there's been scrutiny around possible undisclosed AI use in opinion and personal essays, even at top-tier outlets. So this isn't just happening at, fringe blogs or struggling local papers. It's across the industry. According to a 2025 study led by the University of Maryland, some 9% of newly published newspaper articles, either partially or fully, were AI generated. And journalists themselves seem pretty divided about how to handle it. There's also a business layer here. Publishers are cutting deals with AI companies. News Corp, which owns the Wall Street Journal, Fox News, etc., struck a deal with OpenAI, reportedly worth more than $250 million over 5 years, allowing its content to be used in AI systems. So that's News Corp content contributing to AI, not AI being used for News Corp, but of course then other organizations will use it. And at the same time, other outlets like the New York Times are suing over copyright concerns. So it's a complicated conversation. It's got layers. Let's discuss how AI is being used in journalism and how newsrooms are trying to draw the line. We're joined by Isabella Simonetti of the Wall Street Journal, who did that profile in the Fortune Reporter, who's gone all in. And we've also got Margaret Sullivan, columnist at The Guardian U.S. and author of the Substack American Crisis, where she recently wrote a piece called In Praise of an Utterly Human Non-AI Voice. Some of you know her as the former public editor, kind of internal critic who had the right to publish her thoughts about the New York Times in the New York Times. She is very critical of how some news organizations and journalists are using AI in that Substack. So good to have you both on the show. Margaret, welcome back. Isabella, welcome to WNYC.
Thanks, Brian.
Isabella, let's start with your reporting. Maybe tell us a little bit more about Nick Lichtenberg at Fortune. How exactly is he using AI in his day-to-day work? What will he use it for? What won't he?
Sure. So I was really interested in writing about what Fortune is doing, having AI help write stories, because it's sort of a contrarian narrative in this very complicated and layered topic. While media executives and reporters are rightfully anxious about AI, this one publication and this one editor, Nick Lichtenberg, is going all in an unpretentious way. So I spent the morning with Nick in February, and I watched how he does his work. So a lot of his stories are generated from press releases or analyst notes, and he'll upload them into Perplexity or Notebook LM, which are AI tools, and prompt them with a headline that he comes up with and say, write a 600-word story framed around this headline. And then he takes that draft, edits it, will sometimes add in his own reporting from conversations he's had, and it quickly can become a publishable story on Fortune's website.
So you're here to make a journalism distinction. You're here as a reporter. Margaret, you're here as an opinion columnist. And as I mentioned in the intro, you argued pretty strongly in your recent piece against the use of AI in journalism. Where do you draw the line?
Well, I thank you, Brian, and thanks for having me. And Isabella's story was fascinating and got a lot of attention for good reason. So it's a great conversation to have. I don't think that I am not saying AI has no place in journalism. So I want to be clear about that. Speaking personally as someone who writes a column for The Guardian and someone who writes a weekly post on Substack under my American Crisis flag, I have chosen not to, ask AI to write my work for me. It's important to me personally that what appears under my byline comes entirely from me. Now, that doesn't mean I don't do a Google search and, read what comes up, and we're all using AI to some extent. I guess, I've also taken a hard look at this at Columbia Journalism School, where I was running a center for a while. And, one of the things that my colleague and I determined was that this is all very much in flux in newsrooms. Standards and practices editors are struggling with it. There's a push and pull between rank and file reporters and ownership that is interested in maximizing profit. There's a lot of tension around this. I guess the one place I would draw the line is if a person's byline, an actual human being's byline, is on a story, I think that person should have written that story.
And what counts as written?
I think you can. Yeah, you've come up with the words and typed them in. I guess you can call that writing.
Right.
It doesn't mean that you don't do research that can be informed by AI. It's certainly, I want to make the point that there have been Pulitzer Prizes won by news teams that have used AI in a very good way as a tool to crunch data, to analyze data, and many journalists use it to transcribe or to translate. I think those things are fine. AI is an incredibly powerful tool. I just don't think that it should be presented as this is the original work of a human being.
So let's open up the phones and our text thread for producers and consumers of journalism, which means everybody's invited on one side or another of that. If you work in journalism, how, if at all, do you use AI? How conflicted do you feel about any way that you are using AI? What are the standards of your news organization if you work for a news organization? What do you think they should be? And anybody else, how do you feel about AI in journalism as a consumer of journalism? When you read or listen to or watch the news, do you expect that everything was reported and written and researched entirely by a human, or are you okay with journalists using AI tools, maybe in some of the ways that Margaret was just describing? Or where do you draw the line or become queasy or uncomfortable or judgmental? 212-433 WNYC, 212-433-9692. You can call, you can text. So, Isabella, we talked about that relatively extreme example of that one person at Fortune. You also spoke with other newsroom leaders, including local outlets like Cleveland.com, that are using AI to draft stories as well as process information, so that, they say, reporters can focus more on reporting. So what was the thinking there?
I think there's been a lot of fear and anxiety around AI in newsrooms and how it's used. And there are some leaders of newsrooms, like the editor of Cleveland.com, who has said, let's take a step back. And this is obviously changing our industry and see how we can use it to our benefit. And his argument was AI can turn a bad draft into something usable in seconds. It has undivided attention it can give to reporters. He was very also all in on AI and said that it's helped his publications cover counties that had gone previously uncovered in Ohio. So that's one side of the coin.
How does it do that? How would, if you don't have a reporter out in the hinterlands, outside downtown Cleveland, how does AI help you cover those areas?
So you can set up different AI tools to scrape local websites and news reports and try to find information about what's happening in local counties and then use that to feed tips to reporters who then can take the tip and report it out and do what we do as journalists.
Margaret, have a problem with that?
I think I know the situation in Cleveland, and Chris Quinn, who's been so outspoken about using AI, and in fact, even wrote a letter to readers about a case in which a young journalist had wanted to get a fellowship at Cleveland.com and withdrew because she'd been told that there was going to be this heavy use of AI in the work that she would be doing. So there's a lot of emotion around this. I think that I think that AI is a really valuable tool, and it's a really slippery slope as well. I mean, Brian, you mentioned this case at the New York Times of their cutting ties with a book reviewer who reviewed a book, incorporated some material that had come from presumably a prompt on AI, on a bot or something, and it returned to him, a chunk of copy that had actually been in the Guardian in a book, in a review of the same book. And so that's one way that things can go wrong. And I also think and know that AI is wrong a lot. And that's why my colleague and I at Columbia, had this kind of informal rule: there must be a human in the loop before anything goes out to the public. So I would say that's a bare minimum that, I wouldn't like to see stories that are being produced by AI and just sort of shoved out there. And believe me, that has absolutely happened. So, it's really early. It doesn't feel like it because it now feels like we've been talking about AI constantly for quite a while, but it is really early in this whole sort of landscape. And I think the rules and practices and all of that are being formed as we speak. And there's also a big conflict between unions that represent reporters and some editors in newsrooms and the management. And that's happening today. In fact, it's happening in these current moments at the chain known as McClatchy, which publishes the Miami Herald and the Sacramento Bee. The union is really rebelling against the idea that their work would be repurposed, their previous work would be repurposed under their own bylines through the use of AI. So, it's really tricky and really complicated.
Here's an interesting text from a listener who writes, disgraceful for anyone to use AI instead of doing their own work. For those of us who don't want to read AI-generated anything, it should be required that anything printed or published utilizing AI is disclosed. So, Isabella, are there practices that are springing up, if you've reported on this, at news organizations to disclose to readers, listeners, viewers, clickers, in what ways AI was used in generating a story?
If we go back to the example of Nick Lichtenberg, the editor at Fortune I wrote about, who's all in on AI, he told me that he initially included disclosures at the bottom of his stories often and shared a byline with Fortune Intelligence, which indicated that the story was assisted by AI and has slowly phased that out and uses the disclosure less frequently because he feels like the work is his own. But to your point, and I think you brought this up earlier, the University of Maryland study that shows there's a good chunk of content on the internet that is generated by AI, and the people who are reading it don't know. So I think it's a real legitimate question to be asking what is the obligation of the journalist or the creator of the content when they're using AI to disclose that to readers.
Joe in Middle Village, Queens, are on WNYC. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Brian, long-time listener.
Glad you're on.
So I'm a journalist. I do book reviews, movie reviews, etc., and been doing it for quite a few years. And how I use AI is more as an editor. I will write the entire review first, and then I will use one of the programs to offer suggestions, and then either I might like some of the phrasing and the words and edit my text accordingly, or it might even point me in another direction or possibly just a single word to use that I like better than the way I did it. But I would never just copy and paste or save something in that was totally AI.
Mm-hmm. So tell me if I understand you correctly. You use AI to edit, but not to write drafts, or sometimes to write drafts?
No, never to write drafts. I have to write the draft myself first. And over the years from writing and working for different outlets, it's great to have an editor to overlook your work before you post something or send something out. And so that's basically the way I use it, as an editor to offer possible suggestions.
Explain a little more of that. How does AI function as an editor on something you've written a draft of?
So maybe it might move my words around in a particular paragraph, or rephrase it, and maybe change one or two words, so that I would then maybe look at a thesaurus or something to come up with another word that I like even more. So I think
you might take its suggestions, or you might not.
If I take their suggestions, I will go back and tweak it and rephrase it then myself, changing whatever words I want, and maybe on occasion I'll use one or two words that they suggest.
Sure. And I'm just curious how you get it to be an editor. Do you give a command, edit this draft for clarity and accuracy, or what do you actually ask your AI tool to do?
Basically, I do all my own research and double check everything. So basically, I'm asking it to rephrase it. And either to shorten it or to offer any other kind of suggestions in the phraseology, or
right. Those are the specifics. But what do you actually enter as your request to the AI? Edit this document.
Well, I use the Google form, so basically I can highlight the text and tell it to rephrase it. Rephrase it.
I see. Joe, thank you very much. Margaret, any problem with what Joe is doing?
I mean, that works for Joe, and he sounds like he really is very moderate about what he actually would then present as one of his reviews, and that probably works fine for him. I mean, some of this is personal. I don't want to do that. I want to write my own work. I'm lucky to have a terrific editor at The Guardian, and someone who reads behind me for my Substack. I think, I use this somewhat overused expression before, but I think that's all a slippery slope. I like the idea for myself of drawing the line and saying, like, my writing and my work is my work. And I've said that to my readers on Substack, that you can take this to the bank. When you read my stuff, it's mine. It's not AI. And I think people appreciate that. And at the same time, I just want to mention, I did this workshop. I participated in a workshop at Columbia in which we had a bunch of facts and quotes and other things. and we sort of fed it into AI. I can't remember exactly what the tool was, and said, write this in the style of the Associated Press, write this in the style of the New York Times, write this in the style of NPR. And it came back, and it was remarkably fast and remarkably, true to those voices. So as I say, it is an amazing tool, and I think my feeling is it has to be used with a lot of care and with some, with some sort of guardrails.
Dorian in Minneapolis has an interesting story to tell as a teacher, I think. Dorian, you're on WNYC.
Yeah.
Hello.
Well, hi, Brian, and hi, Margaret. It's funny, the example I was going to give actually resonates with the one you just gave, Margaret, where we've had the pleasure of meeting at Columbia J School, which is one of the places. I teach a business of media course, and I assigned my students as an exercise to do a business analysis, have AI do it, and then for the students to analyze and critique that AI draft. And I witnessed two students in front of me in one of my classes arguing about whether it was appropriate for me to do that or not. One student kind of took the position of, how dare you, we're journalism students, how dare you assign us AI? And another student said, no, the point was to teach us, we're going into the workplace where AI is going to be used, it's to teach us what it does and how we might need to work with it and understand where it does and doesn't work.
Dorian, thank you very much. Isabella, beyond the factual errors and hallucinations, so-called hallucinations, which are basically factual errors, there's also a concern that AI writing can be very convincing. Does that seem like something people are excited about or concerned about? Is this anything that's come up in your reporting on journalists' use of AI?
What do you mean by convincing, Brian?
The way I've seen it described is it can be wrong, but it looks very much like it's right.
Interesting. Yes. Obviously, I spoke with Nick during the reporting for my story on Fortune about hallucinations. And there was actually a piece in the New York Times a couple weeks ago that compared literary passages with passages written by AI. And it was sort of a quiz where you went through and picked, do you prefer this passage or this one? And a lot of the ones that people picked ended up being the ones written by AI. So there is this question, AI can be a great writer. At times, depending on how you feel and what you think of it. So I think that's a legitimate concern, and you can read something and it sounds very authoritative. But if you don't really know your facts, you can't catch it in making the mistake.
Let's see. We're getting a few phone calls in reaction to the earlier caller who described using AI as an editor. Jennifer in Jersey City, you're on WNYC. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi, Brian. How are you?
Good, thanks.
My example is, I'm not a journalist per se, but I work for a scientific conference that is a very specific high-level biotech, and I do a lot of writing for that. And I took a course once called Ethical AI, and it taught me how to feed it examples of my writing and then use it as an editor to say, can you rewrite this in my tone? Which, again, I don't use per se. I just use as another editor who's looking at my work, and I will use pieces of it. I will use examples, but I found that really helpful.
All right. Thank you very much. So another one kind of using it a little bit like that. And there's also, Isabella, the question of bias, right? AI systems are trained on massive data sets, and they can reflect certain cultural or even political assumptions. Is there concern that relying on these tools, even for research, could introduce hidden biases into news coverage?
Of course, that's a concern, just like it would be for a human. And I think Margaret talked a little bit about this. Most newsrooms that are using AI have a human behind them vetting the content and checking for hallucinations and biases the bigger question, which I think we discussed, is whether or not they disclose that they're using AI in the first place. But I think it's important that there's a human layer to check against bias that is totally possible to come from these AI tools.
Yeah. And just let me zoom in on the business side for a second before you go. Because as I mentioned in the intro, the parent company of the Wall Street Journal, News Corp, signed a major deal with OpenAI, reportedly worth more than $250 million. And as I understand it, that gives OpenAI access to both current and archived articles from publications like the Journal to help train its models and even surface that content in AI-generated answers. Actually, Margaret, let me get a take on that from you, because that deal might have implications for, Wall Street Journal copy and Wall Street Journal voice and politics, to the extent that it has politics, showing up in other news organizations' content.
Right. I mean, you make such a great point when you say AI is only as good as what it is sort of incorporated. What it's a kind of garbage in, garbage out potentially. So if the material that it's being fed or that it's feeding on is full of cultural biases, then the product is going to be full of cultural biases. And I think we have to put this whole thing, too, in the context of news companies and news organizations and sort of the media writ large in a really tumultuous moment financially. So anything that looks like it's going to help them, stay afloat or, bring in so-called efficiencies, which could mean eliminating reporter positions or editing positions, is going to seem very attractive. So you can't really just look at it as, is this a good idea from the perspective of journalism, but rather what are the other motivations that are happening behind the scenes. And I think that's a very potent part of this whole discussion.
So respond, Margaret, to this one more text with your opinion, and then we're out of time. If you train your AI agent to write in your own personal style and then utilize what you have trained it to sound like the authentic you and use AI as a tool rather than a, quote, cheap way out, then is that not expanding your creative palette? What would you say to that listener as a last thought?
I would say maybe for somebody else, but not for me. I don't want to do it that way. I want to actually use my human capability to create and not rely on what amounts to machine learning.
And there we leave it with Margaret Sullivan, columnist at The Guardian US and author of the Substack American Crisis, where she recently wrote a piece called In Praise of an Utterly Human Non-AI Voice, and Isabella Simonetti of the Wall Street Journal, who did that profile on the Fortune reporter who's gone all in on AI. Thanks so much for having a complicated conversation with us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us, Brian, and thanks, Isabella.
Thank you.